Snow came down like it had a grievance with the earth, thick and quiet, swallowing the plains until even memory felt buried beneath white. Caleb Boone noticed it first in the way the wind worried his door, testing the hinges like a patient hand. At 30, he had learned to read such signs, learned that storms did not ask permission and neither did loneliness, which was why he had not expected the knock that followed, soft enough to be mistaken for the wind itself, and heavy enough to change the shape of his life, if only he had known it then. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in like an accusation, and with it stood a young woman no more than 21, snow caught in her dark braids, cloak thin and travel-worn, eyes lowered not in weakness but in exhaustion that had learned restraint. Her name, he would later learn, was Ayanna Redfeather, but in that moment she was only a silhouette against the storm, breathing shallowly as if even the air might be taken from her if she asked for too much. She did not plead or explain. She only whispered, "I'll sleep on the floor. I'm tired," and the words settled between them with the weight of a life already measured by refusal. Caleb hesitated, not because he wanted to turn her away, but because the world had trained him to fear what kindness might cost. He had seen how towns looked at women like her, how mercy could be mistaken for ownership, how silence could become rumor by morning. Still, he stepped aside, opening the door wider, and that single movement felt heavier than any oath he had ever sworn, because it was the first time in years he had allowed another soul to cross his threshold, and the storm watched closely as if waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and old wood, a lonely place that had learned his shape too well. Caleb pointed to the far corner near the hearth without speaking, and Ayanna nodded as if she had expected nothing more. She folded her cloak with care, removing her snow-soaked moccasins and setting them neatly by the wall, each movement deliberate, dignified, as though the floor were a guest bed and not the last mercy of a world that had offered her very few. Caleb turned away, pretending to busy himself with the fire, yet every sound she made pulled at something he had buried alongside his father years before. She slept lightly, curled near the warmth, and even in rest her body held tension, as though sleep itself were a negotiation she did not trust. Caleb lay awake on his cot, listening to the wind scrape against the walls, wondering how a person could arrive so quietly and yet unsettle the silence he had worked so hard to preserve. He told himself this was temporary, that morning would bring decisions, explanations, perhaps separation, but the night lingered, stretching time thin, and curiosity stirred where certainty used to live. Morning came pale and cold, the storm easing but not leaving, and light spilled across the cabin like a cautious visitor. Ayanna rose before him, smoothing her dress, eyes still careful, and he noticed how she waited, as if permission were an invisible thing she had learned to feel for. He set out food without comment, coarse bread and beans, and stepped back, giving space rather than reassurance. She ate slowly, gratefully, and that simple act struck him harder than any plea might have, because gratitude without expectation carried its own quiet ache. As the hours passed, they moved around each other like strangers learning the shape of a shared silence. Ayanna offered help with the chores, her hands red from cold but steady, and Caleb found himself watching the way she worked, not out of suspicion now but recognition. She did not rush, did not complain, did not seek praise. Survival had taught her economy of motion and speech, and he wondered what kind of life shaped a person into someone who asked so little yet gave so much without being asked. The world beyond the cabin pressed close despite the snow. Caleb knew the danger of being seen, of being misunderstood, and that fear crept into his thoughts like frost. He imagined neighbors riding past, eyes sharp with judgment, imagined harm meant for her that would come knocking next. Protection began to tangle with distance, and he grew quieter, more guarded, which Ayanna noticed even before he did. She had learned the signs of retreat too well to miss them now. That evening, as the fire burned low, she gathered her few belongings, movements calm, expression composed, and set them by the door. She did not accuse or ask for explanation. Pride held her spine straight as she said she would leave before dawn, before she became a burden, before kindness soured into resentment. The words were careful, practiced, and Caleb felt the weight of them settle into his chest, heavy with all the time she must have said something similar elsewhere. He stopped her not with speech but with action, reaching for his father's old blanket, the one worn thin by years of use and memory, and placed it gently over her shoulders. His voice came rough when he finally spoke, not with promises or claims, but with honesty, admitting fear rather than authority, loneliness rather than power. Ayanna looked up then, truly looked at him, and in her eyes he saw neither gratitude nor submission, but something steadier, something like recognition, and the room seemed to hold its breath at what that might mean. The snow continued to fall outside, soft and unrelenting, as if reminding them both that the world would not change simply because they had, and yet something had shifted all the same, quiet and irreversible, like a door left open just enough to let warmth travel farther than it ever had before. The days that followed did not soften simply because the storm had passed. Snow melted, but judgment did not. Once the roads opened and riders began to pass again, the world slowly leaned back toward Caleb Boone's ranch, curious and sharp-eyed. Whispers traveled faster than hooves, and every glance carried the weight of an opinion already formed. Caleb felt it in the way greetings shortened, in the way doors stayed half-closed. Ayanna felt it more deeply because she always had, because judgment had been a language spoken to her long before words ever were. In town, eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, measuring her presence as if it required justification. Some spoke politely but stiffly, others with a silence that cut sharper than insult. Ayanna continued her days as she always had, helping where she could, mending, gathering, offering care without asking to be seen. Yet each act felt heavier now, as though respect were something fragile she had to keep proving she deserved. At night, when she sat by the fire, the weariness in her eyes was not from work but from carrying dignity like armor that could never be set down. Caleb watched this quiet strain with growing unease. He had thought shelter and steadiness would be enough, that protection could exist without declaration, but the world was not fooled by silence. He began to understand that his restraint, once meant as respect, was now being mistaken for uncertainty. Every few sentences of his own thoughts returned to the same question. When does caution become cowardice, and how much harm does it do before it finally speaks? The tension broke one cold afternoon near the church, where words were meant to bring comfort but often sharpened into weapons. A man spoke too loudly, his voice edged with righteousness, questioning Caleb's honor, questioning Ayanna's place, questioning a bond that had not yet been named but was already being judged. The crowd did not rush to defend or condemn, they simply watched, which somehow felt worse. Caleb answered, his voice steady but strained, saying only that no kindness was shameful and no dignity misplaced. The response was not applause or understanding, only a heavy quiet that followed them home like a shadow. That night Ayanna told him she would leave. Not in anger, not in tears, but with the calm resolve of someone who has learned how to step away before being pushed. She said his life would be easier, his name lighter, and her words were gentle enough to wound deeply. Caleb felt something inside him give way then, a final splinter of hesitation breaking loose. He realized that loving quietly was no longer enough when silence itself had become a wound. The next morning he stood before the same people who had judged him and spoke with a clarity that surprised even himself. He said Ayanna was his chosen family, that her presence brought no dishonor, and that if standing beside her cost him comfort, he would pay it gladly. His words were not dramatic or angry, they were simple, and that simplicity unsettled the crowd more than fury ever could. Some faces hardened, others softened, and a few looked away, confronted by their own reflection. From a distance, Ayanna watched, heart pounding, realizing that respect was not something she had to earn alone. The decision to marry did not arrive with celebration but with calm certainty, like the land settling after a long winter. They chose a day when the snow lay light and clean upon the ground, when the sky stood open and pale above them. Old Woman Willow came quietly, her presence steady and knowing, carrying the weight of tradition without forcing it into spectacle. The ceremony was small, held beneath the open sky, where breath showed and silence felt sacred rather than empty. Ayanna wore garments that honored her people, simple and beautiful, each stitch carrying memory. Caleb stood beside her in plain clothes, shoulders squared not with pride but with acceptance. Their vows were spoken softly, not as promises of perfection but of effort, respect, and shared endurance. Snow creaked beneath their boots, wind brushed past like a witness, and in that moment the world felt stripped down to what truly mattered. Life after did not turn suddenly easy, but it grew warmer in ways that counted. The ranch filled with quiet rhythms shared rather than endured alone. Mornings began with purpose, evenings with rest that felt earned. Neighbors adjusted in their own time. Some offered kindness late, others never did, but the weight of their judgment lessened as the couple remained steady. Ayanna's laughter returned slowly, tentative at first, then freer, and Caleb learned that happiness was not loud but persistent. On winter nights, when snow fell again and the fire crackled low, Ayanna would hum softly and Caleb would listen, understanding at last that a single tired whisper had been enough to change everything. Their life was not untouched by hardship, but it was rich with meaning, built on choice rather than permission. Somewhere beyond their walls, the world continued its judging, but inside, dignity and love had found a place to rest, and that was enough to let the story carry on.